Well, there's a common phrase that talks about when the rubber meets the road. And what that means is that everything in life is theoretical until it has to become practically applied to daily life. Every car is roadworthy until it gets on the road and we find out whether or not it is. And so what he's telling us is that the Christian life is really easy when we're dealing with it only conceptually. Or if you're just a cultural Christian, you kind of like the civilization that comes with Christian culture, but you don't really want to be a follower of Jesus yourself. And I think that when you decide that you're going to not be just a cultural Christian or a conceptual Christian, or what we sometimes call a carnal Christian, I'm saved, but I don't really follow Jesus. When you make that decision that you're going to be a committed Christian, then I'm going to take my faith seriously and I'm going to try to live it earnestly and to its fullest, you find that that's really where it becomes challenging and difficult. Now, for me, before I got saved, one of the reasons I struggled with surrendering my life to Christ is I had encountered so many casual Christians, so many carnal Christians, so many people who told me they were Christians, they went to churches and all that sorts of stuff. Even some of my own guys that I hung out with considered themselves Christians. It's kind of like Bill Clinton calls himself a Christian, so does Barack Obama, and so does Joe Biden. But none of them in any way practice a lifestyle that's consistent with Christianity. I don't say that judgmentally. That's just a very easily observable fact. And it was that very kind of hypocrisy, that posing, that made me say, I don't want to be that kind of a hypocrite. I don't want to be something that I'm not. So that when I gave my life to Christ, I decided, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it 100%. I'm going to throw myself all into it. And so I remember I stepped away from school and I just got into a discipleship ministry. And boy, I just never looked back. Now, that's not to say I perfectly managed all of that. I mean, I've had my ups and downs like anybody else. But when he talks about Christ and him being sinless, listen to what he says in verse 23 about him. Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. Now, we know about Christ's suffering on the cross. We can even recognize Christ's suffering in the road to the cross, the Via Dolorosa, if you will. We know about his suffering in the Antonia Fortress or the Palace of Herod, whichever was a true location. Scholars debate this, where he was beaten and abused and mocked and ridiculed and spitted on. We understand all of that. We understand that he was imprisoned by the Sanhedrin for a while before he was delivered over to the Romans and all the things that went with it. It was a terrible set of things to go through. And yet he says, what we need to understand is from beginning to end, even though he was reviled. Now, revile is such an interesting word because it means to be treated as if you're something stinky that got stuck on the bottom of your foot. Like you stepped in dog poo. You're treated as something that nobody wants to touch. It's like, as recently, I'm going to get really gross here, I'm sorry, but recently where one of my grandkids had a really bad case of explosive diarrhea, and I had to clean it up. And I'm so noble, I volunteered to do it so my wife wouldn't have to do it, just because I didn't want to have to clean up her vomit afterwards. But the bottom line was, that's an idea of being reviled means that you are just people who want nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with you. You see, most people commonly wilt under that kind of ostracism and rejection and marginalization and mocking. Most of us do anything to avoid having that done to us. And I'm afraid that it's that same kind of cowardice that we often see even within the pulpits where pastors are trying to navigate their messages in such a way that they're avoiding saying anything that would be offensive. And so they end up not saying anything that's very definitive either. You can interpret it either way. They're kind of like trying to work their way through the rapids, not to get caught in the rocks. And as a result, they're so careful that they actually never get out of the harbor. And I think that it's so important that we don't live in that fear of man. Now, most of us are what the psychologists would call are codependent. as opposed to the narcissists. Narcissists are people who don't get ulcers. They give them. They don't care about anybody else. They don't care about what anybody feels. They don't have any empathy for you. You're an object to be used for their own advancement, advantage, blessing, and enrichment. But most of us aren't like that. Most of us want to be liked. We want to have friends. And unfortunately, most pastors are not narcissists. They're codependent. And I tend to be on that side of the scale, I'm afraid, as well. And yet it takes courage to look at that and say, but I'm not going to let that define who I am or what I do. Now, most people tell me that, they know that I speak pretty directly about what I think or I feel. And, but I don't really kind of revel in that or take any pride in that. I don't know how that was born into me. I think I may have gotten my family. I'd like to say it's due to the Holy Spirit, but the bottom line is I don't like being reviled either. I don't like those angry, hateful emails that you get where people call you bad names and question both your sanity as well as your intelligence. None of us like that. But at the same time, the idea of being silent about things that needs to be said is even more unacceptable. And so when you find yourself reviled, I find that many times I can't even respond to those very angry, hateful emails that I get and text messages I get sometimes, because the whole point is that I keep on thinking of really snarky things to say in response. One guy wrote me one time, and I wanted to write him back and saying, I always operated under the assumption that you were a pretty intelligent man, but I'll never make that mistake again. And I had to stop myself and say, no, just let it go. Just let it go, because God will deal with him. God will work in his life. And someday we can just have a conversation and I won't have to get past that snarky remark. Because snarky remarks are things that I kind of get into. But we have to understand that Jesus never gave snarky remarks. He didn't say things just to get even. He didn't seek to put people in their place. And sometimes we look at what Jesus did and how he reacted, and we realize that people were put in their place. And sometimes he really called out people because it was so egregious. But who he called out the most were not ordinary people or common people. Who he called out most of the time were people who were setting a bad example because of their authority and their leadership. As the old saying goes, he was speaking truth to power. He was speaking truth to people who didn't often have anybody confront them. In fact, most people were afraid to, because they knew that they could end up like Jesus did, and so they kept their mouths silent. So it takes real courage, I think, for us to get past our own fears and to be able to say things because they're true, because we've decided, as Solzhenitsyn put it so eloquently, we no longer want to live by lies. And so when Jesus spoke to people, he didn't revile them even when they're reviling him. And probably the greatest example is when he's on the cross and they're gambling over his garments. The crowds are shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Jesus' response is, "Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing." He knew that there was useless for him to say anything of a corrective or a rebuke to those people. So he did is he directed his focus to the Father and said, "God, forgive them. They don't have a clue what they're doing. Be merciful to them." Then secondly, what Peter says here is that when he suffered, he did not threaten. You ever find yourself thinking about how you're going to get even for something that somebody's done or said? Jesus didn't do that. What Jesus did is he forgave them. And I have found that the only way I can keep from going insane sometimes when I feel like people have let me down or betrayed me or disappointed me in some way is just simply pray and say, "God, help me to forgive them, help me to forgive them, help me to forgive them." Because I know if they had any clue of how painful or hurtful that was, they probably wouldn't have done that. They're probably reacting out of their own fear and their own frustration. So, Lord, Father, forgive them, because that's what Jesus is. He didn't threaten people. He forgave them. And even though there are some people we look at and say, they deserve to go to hell, in truth, I don't think anybody doesn't deserve to go to hell, and I don't want anybody to go to hell. I don't want people to get what they deserve. I want them to get grace. I want them to get mercy, because mercy is not giving people what they deserve. Grace is giving them something they clearly do not deserve. And finally, it says he committed himself to him who judges righteously. And that's kind of a way of saying that he understood that the end of the story wasn't going to be on the cross, that the end of the story was going to be in glory, was going to be in the presence of the Father, was going to be having everything put under him and him being the ultimate authority, that he was going to be lifted up and exalted. And so you and I need to remember that no matter how difficult we're being treated, how unfairly we're being treated, we're all in a way kind of Josephs who have been betrayed by our families and sold into slavery, and betrayed by our slave masters and sold into prison and left there to die. And yet God never lost sight of Joseph. He had his eye on him constantly. Like the song says, he has his eye on the sparrow and he has his eye on me. So regardless of what you're going through, God knows God is going to use that. Embrace what he's doing in your life right now by saying, Father, let me forgive those who are the perpetrators, and let me, Lord, pray for your forgiveness for them, and give me the grace, Lord, to focus on my rewards, not on this moment that I'm in right now. Blessings.